The river churned with ruthless abandon, its hungry currents pulling at Eleanor Kincaid's skirts as she clung to a half-submerged boulder, her golden mare already vanished beneath the raging waters. Montana Territory, 1878, a beautiful land that could turn deadly in an instant, just as it had today when what should have been a simple river crossing became a desperate fight for survival. "Help!" Eleanor screamed, her voice barely audible above the roaring waters. Her fingers, already bloodied from gripping the rough stone, were losing their strength. The spring melt had turned the usually placid Clearwater River into a monster, and now it seemed determined to claim her as it had claimed her horse. A movement on the far bank caught her eye, a rider, tall in the saddle, urging his stallion along the shoreline, tracking her position as the current pushed her downstream. The man's face was set in grim determination as he guided his horse to a bend in the river ahead of her. "Hold on." The deep voice carried across the water. "I'm coming for you." Eleanor's arms trembled with exhaustion. She had been traveling to Lewiston in Idaho Territory to take a position as the town's new schoolteacher when the disaster struck. Now, as the current tugged at her body, she wondered if she would ever see the schoolhouse at all. The stranger on horseback disappeared from view, and Eleanor felt a surge of panic. Had he abandoned her? But moments later, he reappeared downstream, his horse now chest-deep in water at a slightly narrower section of the river. He was creating a barrier with his own body and that of his mount, positioning himself where the current would carry her. "Let go," he called. "The river will bring you to me." Eleanor hesitated, her knuckles white against the rock. "Trust me," he shouted. "I'll catch you." With one last prayer, Eleanor released her grip. The current immediately seized her, tumbling her beneath the surface. Water filled her nose and mouth as she fought to return to the air. When she broke the surface, gasping, she was already halfway to the man. His arm shot out as she approached, strong fingers closing around her wrist. The force of the water threatened to tear her from his grasp, but he held firm, pulling her toward him with powerful strokes until she was pressed against his horse's side. "I've got you," he said, his voice calmer now that she was within reach. "Hold onto the saddle while I get us to shore." Eleanor did as instructed, clinging to the leather as the man skillfully guided his horse back toward the bank. The animal fought against the current, its muscles straining beneath sleek chestnut hide. When they finally reached shallow water, the man dismounted in one fluid motion and lifted Eleanor from the water as though she weighed nothing at all. He carried her to dry ground and set her down gently on a patch of sun-warmed grass. Only then did Eleanor get her first good look at her rescuer. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of the Montana sky and a square jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard. His clothes were those of a working cowboy, practical, well-worn, and currently soaked through. "Thank you," Eleanor managed, her teeth chattering despite the warm May afternoon. "I thought I was going to die in there." "Not while I was around," the man replied, shrugging out of his duster and wrapping it around her shoulders. It was damp but offered some protection against the breeze. "Name's Benjamin Xavier. Most folks call me Ben." "Eleanor Kincaid," she replied, pulling the coat tighter around herself. "I was on my way to Lewiston to take up a teaching position." Ben Xavier knelt beside her, his expression concerned. "You're a long way from Lewiston still. And now without a horse." The mention of her mare brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Daisy was a gift from my father. She's carried me all the way from Denver." Ben's gaze softened. "I'm sorry about your horse, Miss Kincaid. The river's unforgiving this time of year." Eleanor looked back at the water that had nearly claimed her life. "Everything I own was in those saddlebags, my clothes, my teaching certificates, my savings." "The river swallowed her horse," Ben said quietly, following her gaze. Then, with newfound determination in his voice, he added, "Then I'll be her horse and her hope." Eleanor looked up, startled by his declaration. "I mean to say," Ben clarified, a slight flush coloring his weathered cheeks, "I'll see you safely to Lewiston. My cabin's not far from here. We can get you dried out, fed, and then I'll take you the rest of the way." "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Eleanor asked, suspicion mixing with gratitude. Ben Xavier stood, offering her his hand. "Because out here we look after each other. It's the code of the West. Besides," he added with a small smile. "I'd be a poor excuse for a man if I left a lady stranded after fishing her out of the river." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. As he helped her to her feet, she felt the strength in his calloused palm and wondered if perhaps the disaster had brought an unexpected blessing. "Can you ride?" Ben asked, gesturing toward his horse, which was now shaking water from its coat. "Yes," Eleanor nodded. "Though I must admit, I'm not eager to cross any more rivers today." Ben's laugh was unexpectedly warm. "Don't worry, Miss Kincaid, the path to my place stays high and dry, and Atlas here is sure-footed even on the worst terrain." As if understanding it was being discussed, the chestnut stallion nickered softly. Ben patted its neck affectionately before helping Eleanor into the saddle. She settled herself, adjusting her sodden skirts as best she could while maintaining some semblance of propriety. Ben took Atlas's reins and began leading the horse along a narrow trail that wound away from the river and up into the surrounding hills. Eleanor watched the back of his broad shoulders as he walked ahead, wondering what sort of man would so readily offer assistance to a bedraggled stranger. "Have you lived in these parts long, Mr. Xavier?" she called, trying to distract herself from the uncomfortable sensation of her wet clothes clinging to her skin. "Born and raised in Colorado," he replied without looking back. "Came up to Montana 5 years ago after the war. Found I preferred the company of mountains and honest work to what was left for me back home." The way he said it suggested there was more to the story, but Eleanor knew better than to pry. Many had sought new beginnings in the Western territories after the devastation of the war between the states. "And you, Miss Kincaid, what brings a teacher all the way from Denver to Lewiston?" Ben asked, skillfully changing the subject. Eleanor adjusted her position in the saddle, wincing as her bruised hands protested. "My father passed away last autumn. There wasn't much keeping me in Denver after that, and when I saw the advertisement for a teacher needed in Lewiston, it seemed like a sign. A chance to start fresh somewhere new." Ben nodded as though her answer confirmed something for him. Fresh starts are what the West was built on. They continued in companionable silence for nearly an hour, the trail gradually ascending until the river was just a silver ribbon in the distance below. Eleanor found herself studying her rescuer more closely as they traveled. Though his clothes were simple and his manner unassuming, there was an air of quiet confidence about Benjamin Xavier that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they crested a ridge, and Ben's cabin came into view. It was a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs set in a small clearing surrounded by ponderosa pines. A thin spiral of smoke rose from the stone chimney, and a small corral stood adjacent to a modest barn. "You left a fire burning?" Eleanor asked, concerned. Ben smiled up at her. "No, madam." "That would be Mrs. Caldwell. She comes by twice a week to help with cooking and washing. Lives down the valley with her son's family." Relief washed over Eleanor. The presence of another woman meant she wouldn't have to worry about impropriety in staying at the cabin of a man. She just met a consideration that hadn't seemed important when she was fighting for her life in the river, but had grown increasingly significant as they traveled. As they approached the cabin, the door swung open, revealing a stout, gray-haired woman with a flour-dusted apron and an expression of surprise. "Benjamin Xavier," she exclaimed. "Who've you brought home looking like a drowned rat, Mrs. Caldwell? This is Miss Eleanor Kincaid," Ben replied, helping Eleanor down from the saddle. "She had a mishap crossing the river. Miss Kincaid, Mrs. Martha Caldwell, the finest cook in the territory and my occasional keeper of sanity." "Pleasure," Eleanor said, extending her hand despite her bedraggled appearance. Mrs. Caldwell's expression softened as she took Eleanor's hand. "Land's sakes, child, you're frozen through. Come inside before you catch your death. Ben, you see to that horse while I get this young lady into some dry clothes." Ben touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he led Atlas toward the barn. Inside, the cabin was simple but surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cheerful blaze already burning. A solid wooden table and chairs occupied the center of the main room, while a curtained alcove presumably contained Ben's sleeping area. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a Dutch oven bubbled promisingly over the fire. "Let's get you out of those wet things," Mrs. Caldwell said, bustling toward a trunk near the window. "Ben's sister left some dresses here last time she visited. She's a bit broader in the shoulder than you, but they'll do until we can dry your things." "Ben has a sister?" Eleanor asked, allowing the older woman to help her out of the damp duster and her ruined dress. "Catherine," Mrs. Caldwell nodded. "Lives in Helena with her husband and their 3 little ones. Comes to visit when she can, though that's not as often as Ben would like." As Mrs. Caldwell helped her change into a simple blue calico dress, Eleanor learned more about her rescuer. Benjamin Xavier had come to Montana in 1873, purchasing a small ranch where he raised horses. He lived simply but was respected throughout the region for his fairness in business and his willingness to help neighbors in need. "Never knew a man better with horses," Mrs. Caldwell said as she helped Eleanor comb the tangles from her long auburn hair. "Some say he understands them better than people." By the time Ben returned from tending to Atlas, Eleanor was seated by the fire in dry clothes, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. Ben paused in the doorway, his expression momentarily unreadable as he took in the sight of Eleanor in his sister's dress, her hair falling in damp waves around her shoulders. Then he cleared his throat and stepped inside, removing his hat. "You look much improved, Miss Kincaid," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Thanks to Mrs. Caldwell's ministrations," Eleanor replied with a smile. "And please, after saving my life, I think you've earned the right to call me Eleanor." Something flickered in Ben's blue eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. "Eleanor, then," he said, the name sounding somehow different in his deep voice. Mrs. Caldwell busied herself at the fireplace, ladling stew into bowls. "Sit down, both of you. Food's ready, and I need to be getting home before dark." Over a hearty meal of venison stew and cornbread, they discussed the practicalities of Eleanor's situation. Her teaching post in Lewiston was to begin in 2 weeks, which gave her some time to recover from her ordeal and perhaps replace some of her lost belongings. "The general store in Copper Creek might have some things you need," Ben suggested, referring to the small settlement a few miles from his ranch. "And the stage to Lewiston passes through there twice a week." "I have no money," Eleanor reminded him, the reality of her situation sinking in fully. "Everything I had was in those saddlebags." Mrs. Caldwell clicked her tongue sympathetically. "Don't you worry about that now, dear. Things have a way of working themselves out." After dinner, Mrs. Caldwell prepared to leave, bundling herself into a shawl despite the mild evening. "I'll be back day after tomorrow," she told Ben, "and I'll bring some things for Miss Kincaid, proper unmentionables and such." Ben's cheeks colored slightly at the mention of unmentionables, but he nodded. "Thank you, Martha. Give my regards to Thomas and the family." Once Mrs. Caldwell had departed, a sudden awkwardness descended between Ben and Eleanor. They were, after all, 2 strangers about to spend the night under the same roof. "I'll sleep in the barn," Ben said, apparently reading her thoughts. "You take the bed." "I couldn't possibly put you out of your own home," Eleanor protested. "The floor by the fire will be fine for me." Ben shook his head firmly. "My mother would rise from her grave and tan my hide if I let a lady sleep on the floor while I took the bed. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I've spent plenty of nights in that barn. Atlas makes for quiet company." Eleanor wanted to argue further but saw the determination in Ben's stance. "Very well," she conceded, "but only for tonight. Tomorrow we'll find a more suitable arrangement." Ben nodded, satisfied with the compromise. He gathered a few items from the cabin, a blanket, a spare shirt, before bidding her good night. "There's a bar on the door if you'd feel safer," he said, gesturing to a heavy wooden beam leaning against the wall. "Though I promise you have nothing to fear from me or anyone else this far from the main trail." "I trust you," Eleanor replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it. Despite having known him for only a few hours, something about Benjamin Xavier inspired confidence. Perhaps it was the way he had risked his own life to save hers, or perhaps it was the respectful distance he maintained despite their unusual circumstances. After Ben left for the barn, Eleanor explored the cabin more thoroughly. It was a bachelor's home, certainly, but cleaner and more orderly than she might have expected. A small bookshelf held a surprising variety of volumes, some practical manuals on animal husbandry and farming, but also several novels, a book of poetry, and a well-worn Bible. On a small desk beneath the window sat a framed tintype photograph of a family, a stern-looking man in Union Army uniform standing behind a seated woman holding an infant, with a young boy and girl on either side. Eleanor studied the image, wondering which of the children had grown into the man who had pulled her from the river. Exhaustion soon overtook curiosity, and Eleanor made her way to the curtained alcove. Ben's bed was simple but comfortable, with a straw mattress covered by several warm quilts. She slipped between them, breathing in the unfamiliar but not unpleasant scent of leather, pine, and something uniquely masculine that must belong to Ben himself. Despite her fatigue, sleep came fitfully. Whenever she closed her eyes, she felt again the terrifying pull of the current dragging her under, heard the roar of the water in her ears. Each time she would jerk awake, heart racing, to the quiet crackle of the fire and the unfamiliar shadows of Ben Xavier's cabin. Eventually, as the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky, Eleanor drifted into a deeper sleep, her dreams finally turning from terror to safety as strong arms pulled her from the churning waters. She awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. For a moment, Eleanor was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-muddled mind. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up quickly. Ben stood by the fireplace, his back to her as he tended to a pan of sizzling bacon. He had already been outside, judging by the fresh wood in the bin and the slight dampness of his shirt collar. "Good morning," Eleanor called, running a self-conscious hand through her tangled hair. Ben turned, his expression warming at the sight of her. "Good morning. I was hoping to have breakfast ready before you woke. How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Eleanor replied, slipping from the bed and smoothing down the borrowed dress as best she could. "Though I kept dreaming about the river." Ben nodded, understanding. "That's natural, after what you went through. The mind takes time to settle after a shock like that." He served her bacon, eggs, and coffee at the table, taking his own plate to sit across from her. Eleanor was struck again by how at ease she felt in his presence despite their brief acquaintance. "I thought we might ride into Copper Creek today," Ben said between bites. "It's Saturday, so the store will be open. You can at least get some essentials to tide you over until we can arrange your travel to Lewiston." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with a sigh. "Mr. Xavier, Ben, I appreciate your kindness more than I can say, but I have no way to pay for anything. I'm completely without funds until I reach Lewiston and can telegraph my bank in Denver." Ben considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "I'll front you the money." "You can repay me when your funds arrive in Lewiston." "That's very generous, but it's settled then," Ben interrupted with a gentle finality that suggested he wouldn't be dissuaded. "We'll leave after breakfast." True to his word, they set out for Copper Creek an hour later. This time, Ben joined Eleanor on Atlas's back, sitting behind her with an arm loosely around her waist to steady her. She was acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, the rhythm of his breathing, the warmth that radiated from him despite the cool morning air. As they rode, Ben pointed out landmarks and told her about the area. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of the land which creeks never ran dry, which meadows produced the best hay, which trails were passable in winter. "You love it here," Eleanor observed as Ben finished describing how the valley before them changed through the seasons. "I do," he agreed simply. "It's not always easy, but it's honest. The land doesn't lie to you or pretend to be something it's not, and when you respect it, it provides." "Is that why you left Colorado?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. Ben was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor worried she had overstepped, but then he spoke, his voice measured. "Partly. After the war, everything felt different. My father had died in '63 at Chancellorsville. My mother followed 2 years later pneumonia, though the doctor said grief didn't help. My sister had married, and the family ranch went to my brother-in-law to manage. There wasn't much place for me there anymore." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly, "about your parents." She felt Ben shrug behind her. "It's the way of things. What about you? You mentioned your father passed. Is your mother still in Denver?" "My mother died when I was 8, Eleanor replied. "It was just my father and me for most of my life. He was a professor at a small college. That's where I got my love of teaching. When he died, the house went to a cousin. I stayed on as a teacher at the girls' school where I'd been working, but it never felt quite right after he was gone." Ben made a sound of understanding. "So we're both orphans making our way." "I suppose we are," Eleanor agreed, feeling a new connection forming between them through their shared losses. Copper Creek proved to be little more than a wide spot in the trail, with a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and a handful of houses clustered around a dusty intersection. Still, after the isolation of Ben's cabin, it felt bustling with activity. The proprietor of the general store, a balding man named Mr. Holloway, greeted Ben with familiar warmth. "Xavier, wasn't expecting to see you until next week. Who's your lovely companion?" "Miss Eleanor Kincaid," Ben introduced her. "She's had some misfortune on her journey to Lewiston. Lost her horse and belongings in the river crossing yesterday." Mr. Holloway's expression shifted to concern. "Heavens, miss, you're lucky to be alive. That river's taken many a good soul over the years." "I would have been among them if not for Mr. Xavier," Eleanor acknowledged with a grateful glance toward Ben. "Well, you've fallen into good hands, that's certain," Mr. Holloway assured her. "Now, what can I help you find today?" With Ben's encouragement and Mr. Holloway's assistance, Eleanor selected the bare essentials she would need until reaching Lewiston: a few simple garments, personal items, and a small valise to carry them in. Ben insisted on adding a sturdy pair of riding boots and a warm shawl to her purchases. "The nights can get cold, even in late spring," he explained when she protested the additional expense. As Mr. Holloway tallied their purchases, the door to the store opened, admitting a well-dressed man in his 40s, accompanied by a younger woman whose elaborate dress and carefully arranged blonde curls seemed out of place in the rustic setting. "Ah, Mr. Blackburn," Mr. Holloway greeted them. "And Miss Clark, what brings you to our humble establishment today? Just passing through on our way back to the ranch," the man replied, his eyes falling on Ben and Eleanor. "Xavier," he acknowledged with a stiff nod. "Blackburn," Ben returned equally coolly. "Miss Clark." The young woman offered a practiced smile. "Mr. Xavier, what a surprise to see you in town." There was an undercurrent of tension that Eleanor couldn't quite decipher. The woman, Miss Clark, was looking at Ben with an expression that mingled interest with something like regret, while Mr. Blackburn regarded him with barely concealed hostility. "Miss Kincaid, may I present Victor Blackburn and his daughter Olivia," Ben said, his tone carefully neutral. "They own the Double B Ranch to the north. Mr. Blackburn, Miss Clark, this is Miss Eleanor Kincaid, newly arrived from Denver." "Charmed," Mr. Blackburn said without warmth. "You're staying at Xavier's place," the implication in his tone made Eleanor bristle. "Mr. Xavier rescued me from drowning yesterday and has kindly offered assistance until I can continue to my teaching position in Lewiston." "A teacher?" Olivia Clark's interest seemed piqued. "How quaint. We should be going," Ben said, placing coins on the counter to settle their bill. "Mr. Holloway, we'll take these items now." As they gathered their purchases, Mr. Blackburn moved closer to Ben, speaking in a low voice that Eleanor nevertheless overheard. "Still playing the knight in shining armor, Xavier? Careful it didn't end well for you last time." Ben's jaw tightened, but he made no reply, simply guiding Eleanor toward the door with a gentle hand at her elbow. Outside, he secured their purchases to Atlas's saddle with quick, efficient movements, his expression unreadable. "I take it you and Mr. Blackburn aren't on friendly terms," Eleanor ventured as they prepared to mount. Ben's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "You could say that. Victor Blackburn believes money entitles him to whatever he wants. We've had disagreements over water rights and grazing boundaries. There was more to it than that," Eleanor suspected, but she didn't press. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred not to discuss with near strangers. They were about to depart when the church bell began to toll, signaling noon. From the small building at the end of the street emerged a slender man in clerical collar who brightened upon seeing them. Ben Xavier, the Lord works in mysterious ways. I was just thinking I should ride out to see you tomorrow, and here you are delivered to my doorstep. Reverend Mitchell, Ben greeted him with genuine warmth. This is Miss Eleanor Kincaid. Eleanor, Reverend Daniel Mitchell. The Reverend, a man perhaps a decade older than Ben with kind eyes and prematurely graying hair, extended his hand to Eleanor. A pleasure, Miss Kincaid. Are you new to our little community? Just passing through, Eleanor explained. I'm on my way to take a teaching position in Lewiston. Ah, Lewiston, I have a colleague there, Reverend Phillips, fine man. The school is fortunate to have secured a teacher. He turned back to Ben. I was hoping you might consider joining us tomorrow for services, and perhaps staying for the community dinner afterward. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned she's been keeping an eye on you, but it does a soul good to fellowship with others now and then. Ben shifted uncomfortably. I'm not much for crowds, Reverend, you know that. I do, the minister acknowledged, but the offer stands as always. He glanced at Eleanor. Perhaps your guest might enjoy meeting some of the local families. Eleanor, sensing Ben's reluctance, was about to decline on both their behalfs when Ben unexpectedly said, We'll think about it. Thank you, Reverend. As they rode back toward Ben's cabin, Eleanor found herself wondering what had transpired between him and the Blackburns. Olivia Clark had looked at Ben with the particular intensity of someone who had once cared deeply, while Victor Blackburn's animosity suggested a grievance beyond mere property disputes. I didn't mean to commit you to church services, Ben said, breaking into her thoughts. If you'd prefer not to go, I understand. I don't mind, Eleanor replied. Actually, I'd like to meet more people from the area, and it might be nice for you to reconnect with your neighbors. Ben was quiet for a moment. I keep to myself for a reason, Eleanor. The less entangled I am with the affairs of Copper Creek, the better. Because of the Blackburns, she ventured, she felt him stiffen behind her. Partly, he admitted after a pause. It's complicated, I understand, Eleanor assured him. We all have our reasons for seeking new beginnings. They rode in silence for a time, the rhythm of Atlas's hooves a soothing cadence beneath them. The day had warmed considerably, with spring sunshine bathing the landscape in golden light. Tell me about teaching, Ben said eventually. What made you choose that path? Grateful for the change in subject, Eleanor spoke about her love of education, how she'd found purpose in opening young minds to new ideas. She described her work at the girls' school in Denver, the satisfaction of watching a student grasp a difficult concept for the first time. You speak about it the way I talk about my horses, Ben observed, with passion. Is that how you came to ranch? Eleanor asked. Your love of horses, in a manner of speaking, Ben replied. I was a cavalry officer during the war, spent more time with horses than men. When it was over, working with them seemed the natural choice. They don't carry grudges or judge a man by anything but how he treats them. As they approached Ben's cabin, Eleanor noticed a wagon parked outside. Mrs. Caldwell stood on the porch, accompanied by a young man who bore a strong resemblance to her. My, you two have been gone a spell, Mrs. Caldwell called as they rode up. This is my son, James, brought me over to do some baking since I heard you had a guest. James Caldwell nodded politely to them both, his curious gaze lingering on Eleanor longer than strictly necessary. He was perhaps 25, with his mother's sturdy build and an open, friendly face. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Kincaid, he said as Ben helped Eleanor down from Atlas. Ma told me about your misfortune, glad to see you've recovered. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, Eleanor replied. Your mother has been very kind. James brought news, Mrs. Caldwell said as they all entered the cabin. The stage from Helena was delayed by a broken axle. Won't be through Copper Creek until Tuesday now, Ben frowned. That changes things. I'd hoped to have Eleanor on Monday's stage. I don't want to impose any longer than necessary, Eleanor began, but Mrs. Caldwell waved away her concern. Nonsense, child. A few more days won't hurt anything. Besides, this gives you time to recover properly from your ordeal. Now, who's hungry? I've got fresh bread cooling and a chicken ready for the pot. Over a lunch that showcased Mrs. Caldwell's considerable cooking talents, James shared news from the surrounding area. A new family had settled 10 miles east, the sawmill was expanding its operations, and there were rumors that the railroad might extend a line through the region within the next few years. "That'll change everything," Ben commented, breaking his customary reserve, "for better or worse." "Progress marches on," James agreed. "Speaking of which, did you hear Victor Blackburn's finally getting his way? County approved his petition to divert part of Willow Creek for his new grazing land." Ben's expression darkened. "That creek feeds half the valley during dry summers. He can't just redirect it for his own use." "Papers are all signed," James shrugged. "He's planning to start work next week, says it'll bring jobs to the area." "It'll bring trouble is what it'll bring," Mrs. Caldwell predicted ominously. "Mark my words." The conversation moved to lighter topics, but Eleanor could see that the news about Willow Creek troubled Ben deeply. When James and Mrs. Caldwell prepared to leave later that afternoon, she found herself standing beside Ben on the porch, watching their wagon disappear down the trail. "Is Willow Creek important to your ranch?" she asked quietly. Ben nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "It's the main water source for my southern pasture. If Blackburn redirects it as he's planning, that land becomes useless for grazing. Can't you fight it legally?" "I've tried," Ben said, a note of resignation in his voice. "But Blackburn has connections with the territorial government. Money talks, especially out here where the law is still flexible." "That's not right," Eleanor said, indignation rising on his behalf. Ben turned to look at her, a sad smile playing at his lips. "A lot of things aren't right, Eleanor, but we make do with what we have." That evening, after a simple supper, they sat before the fire as twilight deepened outside. Ben had produced a bottle of whiskey and offered Eleanor a small measure, which she accepted after only brief hesitation. "To survival," Ben toasted, raising his glass. "And to unexpected kindness," Eleanor added, touching her glass to his. The whiskey burned pleasantly down her throat, warming her from within. In the flickering firelight, Ben's features seemed softer, the permanent furrow between his brows less pronounced. "Will you tell me what happened between you and the Blackburns?" Eleanor asked, emboldened by the whiskey and the intimate setting. "I understand if you'd rather not, but—" Ben contemplated his glass for a long moment. "It's no great secret," he said finally. 3 years ago, Olivia Clark and I were close. She's Victor's stepdaughter from his second marriage. Her mother died last year." "You courted her?" Eleanor prompted when Ben fell silent. "Yes, for nearly a year, I even thought." He trailed off, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter what I thought. Victor had other plans for her. A wealthy cattle baron from Oregon with political connections. When Olivia told him she preferred me, he made it clear that choice wasn't available to her. Surely as an adult, she could make her own decisions." Ben's laugh held no humor. "You'd think so. But Victor Blackburn wields considerable influence, and Olivia's inheritance left by her father is controlled by him until she marries or turns 30. He made it abundantly clear that if she chose me, she would be cut off without a penny." "And she chose money over love," Eleanor concluded softly. "She chose security," Ben corrected without rancor. "I can't blame her entirely. I could offer a good life, but not the kind she was raised to expect, and Victor would have made things difficult for us at every turn." "So instead, he's targeting your water supply," Eleanor observed. "Among other things," Ben nodded. "He's been trying to force me to sell for the past year. This latest move with Willow Creek might just succeed where his other tactics failed." "That's terrible," Eleanor said, genuinely outraged. "There must be something that can be done." Ben shrugged, refilling their glasses. "I'm exploring options, but enough about my troubles. Tell me more about this teaching position in Lewiston. What will you be teaching?" Eleanor allowed the change of subject, describing the small school where she would be responsible for all grades from primer to 8th. As they talked, the fire burned lower, and their conversation drifted from topic to topic with the easy flow of old friends rather than new acquaintances. When Eleanor finally yawned behind her hand, Ben immediately stood. "I've kept you up too late. You're still recovering from yesterday's ordeal." "I've enjoyed the conversation," Eleanor assured him, "but I am rather tired." "I'll head to the barn then," Ben said, collecting their empty glasses. "Sleep well, Eleanor." "Ben," she called as he reached the door, You don't have to sleep in the barn, it's your home. I can take the floor by the fire, truly. Ben smiled, shaking his head. My mother raised me better than that. I'm perfectly comfortable in the barn, but thank you for the offer. After he left, Eleanor prepared for bed, her mind full of all she had learned about Benjamin Xavier. He was a more complex man than she had initially assumed, a former cavalry officer who preferred the company of horses to people, a rancher who read poetry, a man whose heart had been broken but who still opened his home to a stranger in need. As she drifted towards sleep in his bed, surrounded by the lingering scent of him, Eleanor found herself wondering what it might have been like to meet him under different circumstances, not as a desperate woman rescued from a river, but perhaps at a social in Lewiston or a church gathering in Copper Creek. The thought followed her into dreams that, for the first time since the river, held no terror, only the warmth of Ben's arms around her waist as they rode together across sun-dappled meadows. Sunday dawned bright and clear. Eleanor woke to find Ben already up and about, the smell of coffee once again filling the cabin. This morning, however, he appeared freshly shaven and wore a clean shirt with his usual work trousers. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I thought you might like to attend services in Copper Creek after all. It's a fine day for a ride." Surprised by his change of heart, Eleanor nodded. "I'd like that very much, though I'm afraid I don't have appropriate attire for church, Mrs. Caldwell brought over another of my sister's dresses yesterday," Ben said, gesturing to a garment laid carefully across the back of a chair. "Said it might do for church going." The dress was a simple but elegant affair of deep green cotton with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Eleanor ran her fingers over the fabric, touched by the consideration. "It's perfect," she said. "Please thank Mrs. Caldwell for me." After a quick breakfast, Eleanor changed into the green dress, which fit better than she had expected. She arranged her hair as best she could without proper pins or mirror, tucking the errant strands behind her ears. When she emerged from behind the curtained alcove, Ben looked up from where he was pulling on his boots. For a moment he simply stared, an expression she couldn't quite interpret flickering across his features. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked, suddenly self-conscious. Ben cleared his throat. "Not at all, you look very nice, Eleanor." The slight hesitation suggested he had been about to say something else, but Eleanor didn't press. Instead, she thanked him and accepted his help with her borrowed shawl. The ride to Copper Creek was pleasant, the spring day warming quickly as the sun climbed higher. Ben seemed more relaxed than he had the previous day, pointing out a family of deer grazing in a distant meadow and identifying various birds by their calls. The small church was nearly full when they arrived, with horses and wagons tethered outside, indicating that many families had traveled some distance to attend. Ben helped Eleanor down from Atlas with careful hands at her waist, his touch lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. Inside, they found seats near the back, drawing curious glances from the assembled congregation. Reverend Mitchell, spotting them from the pulpit, offered a warm smile of welcome. The service was simple but heartfelt, with enthusiastic, if sometimes off-key singing and a sermon on the importance of community during difficult times. Eleanor found herself genuinely moved by the Reverend's words about neighbors supporting one another through drought, harsh winters, and personal tragedies. Beside her, Ben sat attentively, occasionally joining in the hymns with a surprisingly pleasant baritone. When their hands accidentally touched during a prayer, neither pulled away immediately, and Eleanor felt a curious flutter in her chest at the contact. After the service, Reverend Mitchell made a point of introducing Eleanor to various members of the congregation. Ben stood quietly at her side, nodding to those he knew but saying little. "You must both stay for dinner," the Reverend insisted. "The ladies have outdone themselves, and there's more than enough for everyone." Tables had been set up outside the church, laden with an impressive array of dishes brought by the various families. Eleanor found herself swept into conversation with several local women who were eager to hear about Denver and her teaching experiences. Ben, meanwhile, was cornered by James Caldwell and several other men. their discussion appearing to revolve around the Willow Creek situation, judging by their serious expressions and occasional glances toward a group that included Victor Blackburn. Eleanor was helping Mrs. Caldwell arrange desserts when Olivia Clark approached her, wearing an elaborate blue dress that seemed better suited to a Denver tea party than a rural church gathering. "Miss Kincaid," Olivia greeted her with a practiced smile. "I hope you're recovering from your ordeal. The river can be so treacherous this time of year." "Thank you, Miss Clark, I'm much better," Eleanor replied politely. "Mr. Xavier has been very kind." Olivia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, kindness is one of Ben's defining characteristics. Though sometimes I wonder if he isn't too kind for his own good." Before Eleanor could respond to this ambiguous statement, Olivia continued, "I understand you're bound for Lewiston. What a shame you won't be staying in our little community. We so rarely get new faces, especially educated ones." "The teaching position in Lewiston is a wonderful opportunity," Eleanor said, "though everyone I've met here has been most welcoming." "Indeed," Olivia agreed, her gaze drifting to where Ben stood with the other men. "Though I should warn you, as one woman to another, that Ben Xavier has a history of involving himself in lost causes. First, it was his hopeless stand against my stepfather's business interests, then his equally futile defense of those squatters last winter." "Squatters?" Eleanor couldn't help but ask. Olivia nodded, leaning closer as though sharing a confidence. "A family of immigrants Russians, I believe, settled on what they thought was unclaimed land. Turned out it was part of the double Btkes northern range. When father's foreman went to evict them, Ben interfered, nearly got himself arrested. In the end, the family moved on anyway, but not before Ben had made himself quite the local hero among certain elements." There was a bitterness in Olivia's tone that belied her pleasant expression. Eleanor was beginning to understand that the history between her and Ben was more complicated than he had indicated. "He sounds like a man of principle," Eleanor observed neutrally. "Principles don't keep the rain off your head or food on your table," Olivia replied sharply, then immediately composed herself. "But of course you're right. Ben has always been principled. If you'll excuse me, I see my stepfather is ready to leave." As Olivia walked away, Mrs. Caldwell returned to Eleanor's side. "Don't let that one bother you," she said quietly. "More polish than substance, if you ask me." "She and Ben were once close," Eleanor said, making it half a question. Mrs. Caldwell snorted. "Close enough for him to offer marriage and her to accept, until her stepfather made it clear she'd not see a penny of her inheritance if she married a man of modest means with dangerous notions about fair treatment for all." "Ben said it was her choice," Eleanor noted, watching as Olivia joined her stepfather near their wagon. "That's Ben for you," Mrs. Caldwell sighed. "Always seeing the best in people even when they don't deserve it. Now come along, you should try some of Harriet Miller's apple pie before the men devour it all." The community dinner lasted well into the afternoon, with conversation flowing as freely as the coffee and lemonade. Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying the company of the Copper Creek residents, most of whom seemed to hold Ben in high regard despite, or perhaps because of his reserved nature. As the gathering began to disperse, Eleanor noticed Victor Blackburn approach Ben, who stood alone near the hitching post. Though too far away to hear their words, she could see the tense set of Ben's shoulders and the barely restrained hostility in Blackburn's stance. She made her way toward them, catching the tail end of Blackburn's statement. "Final offer, Xavier. Take it or lose everything." "Is everything all right?" Eleanor asked, deliberately inserting herself into their conversation. Blackburn turned to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a business discussion, Miss Kincaid. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." "Mr. Blackburn was just leaving," Ben said, his voice steady despite the muscle working in his jaw. "Weren't you, Victor?" With a last meaningful look at Ben, Blackburn tipped his hat to Eleanor and strode away to where Olivia waited by their wagon. "What was that about?" Eleanor asked quietly. Ben watched Blackburn's departure with narrowed eyes. "He's offering to buy my ranch at half its value. Says if I don't sell by the end of the month, I'll find myself without water for my stock once his creek diversion is complete." "That's extortion," Eleanor exclaimed, indignation coloring her voice. That's business, according to Victor Blackburn, Ben replied grimly. Come on. We should head back before it gets much later. The ride home was quiet, Ben clearly preoccupied with thoughts of his confrontation with Blackburn. Eleanor respected his silence, understanding that he had much to consider. As they approached the cabin, however, Ben suddenly reined Atlas to a halt, his posture alert. What's wrong? Eleanor asked, sensing his tension. Smoke, Ben said tersely, pointing toward the horizon where a thin dark column rose above the trees in the direction of his ranch. He urged Atlas into a gallop, and Eleanor clung to the saddle horn as they raced toward the cabin. As they crested the final ridge, Ben swore under his breath, and Eleanor gasped at the sight before them. The barn was ablaze, flames leaping from the roof as smoke billowed skyward. Without hesitation, Ben spurred Atlas down the slope, pulling up near the cabin which thankfully remained untouched and leaping from the saddle. Stay here, he commanded, running toward the burning structure. Eleanor dismounted anyway, her heart in her throat as Ben disappeared into the smoke-filled doorway of the barn. Moments later, he emerged leading two panicked horses, a dappled mare and a young colt coughing as he guided them to safety in the nearby corral. Before Eleanor could stop him, Ben plunged back into the barn. This time when he emerged, he was half carrying, half dragging an unconscious man. Eleanor ran to help, taking some of the man's weight as Ben lowered him to the ground a safe distance from the burning building. Who is he? Eleanor asked, recognizing neither the man's face nor his clothing. One of Blackburn's hands, Ben said grimly, checking the man for injuries. Appears he knocked himself out trying to escape after setting the fire. The man groaned, beginning to regain consciousness as Ben turned his attention back to the barn. The structure was now fully engulfed, the heat intense even from where they stood. The hay and feed are lost, Ben said, his expression grim. And most of my tack, but at least the horses are safe. Blackburn did this? Eleanor asked, though the answer seemed obvious given the timing. Ben nodded, his face set in hard lines. A warning. Next time it could be the cabin or worse. The injured man was stirring more vigorously now, his eyes fluttering open to fix on Ben with a mixture of fear and defiance. Mr. Blackburn sends his regards. The man slurred, attempting and failing to sit up. Says you should reconsider his offer. Ben's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might strike the prone man. Instead, he took a deep breath, visibly mastering his anger. Tell Blackburn that burning a man's barn won't change his mind, Ben said evenly. Now get off my property before I forget I'm supposed to be civilized. The man stumbled to his feet, swaying slightly but managing to mount his horse, which was tethered in the trees beyond the corral. With one last malevolent glance over his shoulder, he rode away, leaving Ben and Eleanor standing before the blazing remains of the barn. I'm so sorry, Ben, Eleanor said, placing a hand on his arm. Ben covered her hand with his own, his eyes still on the fire. This changes nothing. I won't be bullied into selling. They worked together to ensure the fire wouldn't spread, using buckets from the well to wet down the area between the barn and cabin. By the time the barn had collapsed into smoldering ruins, they were both exhausted, their clothes and faces streaked with soot. Inside the cabin, Eleanor heated water while Ben tended to the rescued horses in the corral. When he returned, she had prepared a basin for washing and set out clean clothes for him. Thank you, he said, genuine gratitude in his voice, for your help out there. I did very little, Eleanor demurred. You're the one who ran into a burning building twice. Ben offered a tired smile. My livelihood was at stake, and those horses, he shook his head. They trust me to keep them safe. After they had both washed and changed, they sat at the table with mugs of strong coffee. The events of the day seemed to have aged Ben. New lines of worry creased his forehead as he stared into his cup. What will you do now? Eleanor asked gently. Ben sighed, running a hand through his hair. Rebuild, I suppose, though without feed for the stock, things will be tight until the next hay cutting. Could you report this to the authorities? Surely arson is a crime even out here. With what proof? Ben asked wearily. The word of a drifting schoolteacher and a rancher known to have a grudge against Victor Blackburn, the territorial marshal would laugh us out of his office. There must be something, Eleanor began, but Ben cut her off with a raised hand. I appreciate your concern, Eleanor, truly. But this is my fight, and I'll handle it my way. The finality in his tone brooked no argument. Eleanor nodded, respecting his wishes even as she worried about what might come next in this escalating conflict. That night, despite Eleanor's insistence that he take his bed after such an ordeal, Ben again slept in what remained of the barn, keeping watch over his nervous horses. Eleanor lay awake for hours, listening to the occasional pop of cooling embers from the ruins nearby, wondering how a simple river crossing had led her into such complicated circumstances. She had known Benjamin Xavier for barely 3 days, yet she found herself deeply concerned for his welfare, impressed by his courage, and increasingly drawn to his quiet strength. The thought of continuing to Lewiston on Tuesday suddenly seemed less appealing than it had before. Monday morning brought new challenges. With the barn destroyed, Ben faced the immediate need to construct at least a basic shelter for his horses and the remaining feed. After breakfast, he set out to fell several trees, intending to build a temporary structure until he could properly rebuild. Eleanor insisted on helping, despite Ben's initial protests. I may be a schoolteacher, but I'm not helpless, she told him firmly. My father believed in practical education for both boys and girls. With grudging admiration, Ben accepted her assistance. Together they worked through the morning, stripping branches from the felled logs, and beginning to assemble a crude but functional lean-to adjacent to the corral. Around midday, they were interrupted by the arrival of a wagon. To Eleanor's surprise, James Caldwell was at the reins, accompanied by 3 other men from Copper Creek. Heard about the fire, James called as he drew the wagon to a halt. Thought you could use some help, Ben straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. News travels fast. Small community, James shrugged. Besides, we all know what Blackburn's about. Figure if we don't stand together, he'll pick us off one by one. The men unloaded tools and supplies from the wagon: nails, saws, hammers, even some spare lumber. With their help, the temporary shelter took shape rapidly, and by late afternoon, it was sufficiently complete to house the horses and what remained of Ben's supplies. Can't thank you enough, Ben said as the men prepared to leave. I didn't expect. Neighbors help neighbors, one of the men, a grizzled blacksmith named Ferguson, stated simply. Been that way since before there was a territory, and damn well should stay that way no matter what fellows like Blackburn think. After they departed, Ben stood looking at the newly constructed shelter, an unreadable expression on his face. Something wrong? Eleanor asked, joining him. Ben shook his head slowly. Just surprised I've kept to myself so much these past years, I didn't think. He trailed off, then started again. It's good to know there are still decent folks willing to stand up for what's right. They respect you, Eleanor observed. That much is clear. Respect won't stop Blackburn, Ben replied grimly, or save my ranch if he diverts that creek. Perhaps not alone, Eleanor agreed, but together with others affected by his actions, that might make a difference. Ben considered her words, his gaze distant. Maybe it's worth considering at least. They ate a simple dinner as twilight settled over the valley. The events of the past 2 days had created a new intimacy between them, a sense of shared purpose that went beyond rescuer and rescued. Eleanor found herself studying Ben's face in the lamplight, admiring the strong line of his jaw and the quiet resolve in his blue eyes. The stage comes tomorrow, Ben reminded her as they washed the dishes together. I'll ride with you to Copper Creek in the morning. Eleanor nodded, feeling an unexpected reluctance at the thought of leaving. Yes, I suppose I should continue to Lewiston. The school term begins soon. You'll make a fine teacher, Ben said with sincerity. Those children are fortunate. Thank you, Eleanor replied softly. Though I admit the past few days have been educational in ways I never anticipated. Ben smiled, one of his rare full smiles that transformed his features and crinkled the corners of his eyes. Not the peaceful journey to a new position you imagined, I'm sure. No, Eleanor agreed, returning his smile, but I wouldn't change it. A moment of charged silence stretched between them, broken only when Ben cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking eye contact. "It's getting late," he said. "And tomorrow will come early enough." That night, Eleanor found sleep particularly elusive. The thought of leaving Ben's cabin and Ben himself filled her with a melancholy she hadn't anticipated. In just a few days, this place had begun to feel like home in a way Denver never had after her father's passing, and Ben Xavier was unlike any man she had met before. His quiet strength, his unwavering principles, his tenderness toward both animals and people in need all combined to create a man she found herself increasingly drawn to. But Lewiston awaited, with children who needed a teacher and a position she had committed to fill. Her path was set, just as Ben's was here, fighting for his land against Victor Blackburn's machinations. Morning came too soon. Pale light filtering through the cabin windows as Eleanor rose and dressed in her newly purchased traveling clothes. Ben was already up, as usual, coffee brewing and breakfast prepared. They ate in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When the meal was finished, Ben helped Eleanor pack her few belongings into the valise they had purchased in Copper Creek. "I'll repay you for everything as soon as I can send to Denver for funds," Eleanor promised as Ben secured the valise to Atlas's saddle. "There's no rush," Ben assured her. "Consider it payment for your help with the shelter yesterday." The ride to Copper Creek was bittersweet, the landscape seemingly more beautiful than ever in the morning light. Eleanor committed each vista to memory, the way the sun gilded the distant peaks, how the wildflowers dotted the meadows with splashes of color, the particular blue of the sky that reminded her of Ben's eyes. The stage was already waiting when they arrived in town, the driver loading mail and parcels as passengers milled about, stretching their legs before the journey continued. Ben helped Eleanor down from Atlas, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. As he handed her the valise, their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of awareness through Eleanor's body. "Thank you," she said, the simple words inadequate for all she wished to express. "For everything." Ben nodded, his expression unreadable. "Safe travels, Eleanor." "I hope Lewiston proves to be all you're hoping for." The driver called for passengers to board. Eleanor took a step toward the stage, then hesitated, turning back to Ben. "Will you write to let me know how things turn out with Blackburn and the creek?" "If you'd like," Ben agreed, a hint of surprise in his tone. "I would," Eleanor confirmed. "Very much." With one last smile, she turned and allowed the driver to help her aboard the stage. As she settled into her seat beside a maternal-looking woman in a practical traveling suit, Eleanor glanced out the window to where Ben stood, Atlas's reins in hand, watching the stage preparations. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition of possibilities unrealized, of paths that might have converged under different circumstances. Then the driver cracked his whip, the horses surged forward, and Copper Creek and Benjamin Xavier began to recede into the distance. The stage had traveled perhaps a mile when Eleanor made her decision. It came to her not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty, as though her heart had known all along what her mind was only now acknowledging. "Driver." She called, leaning forward to rap on the roof of the coach. "Driver, I need to get off." The woman beside her looked startled. "Miss, we've barely begun the journey." "I know," Eleanor said, a smile spreading across her face, "but I believe I've left something important behind." The driver, grumbling about schedules and delays, nevertheless brought the coach to a halt. "Make it quick, miss," he warned as he helped her down. "Stage waits for no one, not even pretty school teachers." "I won't be continuing to Lewiston today," Eleanor informed him, retrieving her valise. "Please tell them I've been delayed but will arrive as soon as circumstances permit." Before the astonished driver could respond, Eleanor had turned and begun walking back toward Copper Creek, her steps quick and purposeful despite the weight of her bag. She had gone perhaps half a mile when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from ahead. Moments later, Ben appeared around a bend in the road, urging Atlas to a gallop. He pulled up sharply when he saw her, disbelief written across his features. "Eleanor, what happened? Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him, setting down her valise. I simply realized I was heading in the wrong direction. Ben dismounted, confusion evident in his expression. The wrong direction, but Lewiston is not where I'm meant to be, Eleanor interrupted gently. At least not yet. Understanding dawned slowly in Ben's eyes, followed by a cautious hope. What are you saying, Eleanor? She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I'm saying that in 3 days you've shown me more about courage, principles, and true kindness than I've seen in years elsewhere. I'm saying that the thought of leaving you to face Blackburn alone feels wrong in every way. She stepped closer, looking up into his weathered face. I'm saying that when a river swallowed my horse and everything I owned, I thought my future was lost as well. But then you appeared and offered to be both my horse and my hope, and now I find I'm not ready to relinquish either. Ben stood very still, his blue eyes searching hers. The teaching position can wait, Eleanor said firmly. I'll write to the school board and explain that I've been unavoidably delayed. If they can't hold the position, there will be others. But right now, I believe I'm needed here more. To help fight Blackburn? Ben asked, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Eleanor smiled back, emboldened by the warmth in his gaze. That, and because I find myself quite unable to leave the man who saved my life without discovering if there might be something worth exploring between us. Ben reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. You've known me barely 3 days, Eleanor Kincaid. I have little to offer beyond a struggling ranch and a stubborn disposition. 3 days can be enough to recognize something true, Eleanor replied, leaning slightly into his touch. As for what you have to offer, I see a man of honor, courage, and unexpected tenderness. That seems like more than enough to build upon. For a moment, Ben simply looked at her, wonder and disbelief mingling in his expression. Then he leaned down hesitantly, giving her every opportunity to step away. Instead, Eleanor rose on her tiptoes, meeting him halfway as his lips found hers in a kiss that held both gentleness and promise. When they finally parted, Ben rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. Are you certain, Eleanor, life here won't be easy, especially with Blackburn set against me? I've never been more certain of anything, she assured him. Besides, I believe you mentioned once that we're both orphans making our way in the world. Perhaps it's time we made that way together. Ben's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then brilliant. He lifted her valise with one hand, offering her the other. In that case, Miss Kincaid, may I escort you back to the ranch? I believe we have a water rights dispute to resolve and a barn to rebuild. Indeed we do, Mr. Xavier, Eleanor agreed, taking his hand and allowing him to help her onto Atlas's back before mounting behind her. And perhaps a future to construct while we're at it. As they rode back toward Ben's cabin, Eleanor leaned comfortably against his chest, his arm secure around her waist. The path ahead would not be easy. Blackburn remained a threat. The ranch needed considerable work, and she would need to sort out her commitments in Lewiston. But with Ben beside her, those challenges seemed less daunting. After all, she reminded herself with a smile when a river had swallowed her horse, this cowboy had offered to be both her horse and her hope. And sometimes, hope was all one needed to begin anew. In the months that followed, Eleanor and Ben faced Victor Blackburn's schemes together. With the support of other ranchers affected by the creek diversion, they brought their case before the territorial governor, who, perhaps influenced by growing public sentiment against such water monopolies, ruled in favor of shared access to the vital resource. Blackburn, thwarted but unrepentant, eventually sold the Double B and moved east, taking Olivia with him. The last they heard, she had finally married her wealthy suitor from Oregon, though rumors suggested the union brought her little joy. Eleanor did eventually travel to Lewiston, but only to explain in person why she could not accept the teaching position. The school board, impressed by her dedication and honesty, promised to keep her in mind should she ever reconsider. Instead, with Ben's encouragement, Eleanor established a small school on their ranch, teaching the children of neighboring homesteaders who had previously been too far from town for regular education. The one-room schoolhouse Ben built for her became a gathering place for the community, hosting not only classes, but also social events and town meetings. As for Ben and Eleanor, They were married that autumn beneath the turning leaves of the cottonwoods by the river that had once nearly claimed her life. James Caldwell stood as Ben's best man, while Mrs. Caldwell fussed over Eleanor like the daughter she'd never had. Together, they rebuilt the barn, expanded the ranch, and created a home that welcomed travelers and neighbors alike with the same generous spirit that had once prompted a solitary cowboy to rescue a drowning schoolteacher. And on cool evenings, they would often sit on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, marveling at how a near tragedy had led to their greatest blessing. "Do you ever regret it?" Ben asked her once, as they celebrated their 5th anniversary, not continuing to Lewiston that day. Eleanor, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder, their 3-year-old son Thomas asleep in his room inside, and their infant daughter Sarah cradled in her arms, smiled up at the man who had become the center of her world. "Not for a moment," she assured him, reaching up to trace the now familiar lines of his face. "How could I regret finding exactly where I belong?" Ben's kiss was as tender as the first they had shared on that dusty road years before, but now deepened by the love that had grown between them through trials and triumphs alike. "When that river swallowed your horse," he murmured against her hair, "I had no idea it would lead me to everything I never knew I wanted." "And when you offered to be my horse and my hope," Eleanor replied, "I never dreamed you would become my heart as well." Together they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, secure in the knowledge that sometimes the most unexpected crossings lead to the most perfect destinations.